Hello, I'm going to do a check-in for Chapter 7 of Clearing the Plains, nonfiction book by James Daschuk, talking about the Plains Indians of Native peoples. I've been reading way too many historical documents at the moment that refer to Native people as Indians. Don't do that anymore. That has happened within my lifetime, so apologies. So talking about how using kind of the politics of the day that was used to clear the plains for white settlers for basically the unification, the founding of Canada. So this is chapter 7, which is Treaties, Famine, and Epidemic Transition on the Plains, 1877 to 82. And this is like in the previous chapters, we've had this sort of thing of like the collapse of the bison is coming. That is coming. The fur trade has collapsed, and now the bison are going to be gone. They will be. It's gonna fall out. And what are we gonna do? And the native peoples, first and foremost, being the ones who understand that that's happening, and are from a relative strength of semi kind of equality with the newly founded Canadian government, have made treaties, and part of the provisions of those treaties being we're going to help you with a transition into an agricultural economy, and if there are famines and stuff like that, we're going to provide relief if there are famines. We won't let you die like dogs, is what one of the negotiators says. And then now, in this period from like 1877, the late 1870s, that happens. The bison collapses. It collapses very suddenly, and finally, like it's not going to be coming back, and it takes everyone off guard. In this situation, they're not prepared for it, and this is under the context of there is the huge amount of cattle being brought up from Texas. I think it's something like 6 to 10 million head of cattle and like 1 million horses from Texas brought up into the area, so that it's not only the bison are getting hunted to extinction, but their territory is their forage, their land is also being taken over by cattle, and cattle which are much more disease prone, carry the most significantly of the diseases that they carry is the TB virus. And so what we find is that the native populations probably were infected with it, with TB, well before the famine happens, where suddenly everyone they are all starving to death. And the seems to be what the thing with TB is it can be there, but you have to have the right conditions for it to really erupt, and that those conditions are extreme starvation. That causes extreme weakening, and the TB takes full force and kills, and it becomes the main killer of native peoples on the plains in these times. It is a full-fledged crisis, and it's like the lieutenant government laird says, in response to this famine, you're either going to help the Indians to farm and raise stock, or you're going to feed them, or you're going to fight them. This happens in the context of John A. Macdonald and his Conservatives get back into power after having basically a huge corruption scandal. It doesn't get mentioned by Daschuk in the book because he's so laser focused on his particular subject. It doesn't provide a lot of context for what's happening outside of that. And part of that is he's got so much to bring in. Part of that might be his limitations as an author. But yes, John A. Macdonald and the Conservatives are getting back in, and they've come back in on a policy of the national policy, which is this idea of we're going to unify the country. One of the big promises, we're going to have a transcontinental railway that will, from sea to shining sea, And Dasyuk characterizes this shift from the liberals of basically kind of relative ignorance to kind of a malevolence, is how he characterized it, is a pacification of Plains Indians. And this is John A. Macdonald, because this is such a key part of his obsession of getting this railway across. He becomes the superintendent of Indian affairs, and that's not because he cares about the native peoples. It's because he cares about making sure that this railway gets across Canada, that the settlers get moved in without the inconvenience, the trouble of native people. Its pacification program is how Dasyuk, um, how he characterizes this. Um, and yeah, it's one of these things of this chapter is, again, it is filled with death and starvation, and people are eating are eating they're eating diseased livestock because it's the only thing they left. They kill the horses. They kill their they kill their dogs. They eat everything they can. Um, and it's like, they're truly in horrible, dire need, and that these are the reports that are coming out. Um, and we have to kind of set this with what's the response of the Dominion of Canada, of the Liberals and of the Conservatives, because I think John A. Macdonald can be castigated for being the leader of the country who's doing this, but you can also see this in the context of the country that is very much. It's like, why are we helping them? It's basically the policy is, oh, you don't want to feed them too much because then they'll just be lazy. It's like, there doesn't seem to be this kind of thing of like, a doctor talks about how we're feeding the rations that we're giving the native people is like half of what you would get for like political prisoners in Siberia. That kind of an idea of just like how meagerly, and just the crappy, terrible rations that are rancid and diseased already. That the Indian agents would never say, like, we would never eat this ourselves, and we're giving it to these people, and basically it's the whole thing of you get the opposition party that's criticizing the Conservatives, like you're giving them too much, you're spending too much money on these basically lazy natives, and John and McDonald's coming up and say, oh no, we're not, obviously, if we feed them they'll just be lazy, so we're waiting, it's truly we're only feeding people at the edge of starvation. And that's the justification. That's like him trying to, like, that is our these white assholes are the these are our ancestors of our country. These are the leaders of our past leaders of our country. It's like, no, charity is something that the church does. A government doesn't do any charity, and if you feed poor people, it's just going to make them lazy. And I mean, you can see that kind of reflections of the same kind of attitudes in our world today about, like, oh, welfare bums and all that stuff. If you get them on welfare, they're just going to be lazy, which is like, that's 0.0000001% are doing that, where there's a lot of other just people who are like, we're scraping by, we're suffering, but you're going to use the most outlying examples to say, oh, we're not going to give anything to anybody whatsoever, which is, it's contemptible now, it's contemptible then. But I mean, for then, it's like, it's killing thousands upon thousands of people, and it's also being used by the conservative government under John A. Macdonald as a way of controlling the natives. It's like, you're only going to get the food if you're on the reserves, and when you're on the reserves, we're going to control you more. You're not going to be able to actually participate in the rest of the economy of the kind of the plains, further exacerbating the thing. They try and set up a program to train them to be farmers, but it's a joke. This home farm system seems to be it's as it's gets characterized by Deathstroke and by it seems like a lot of other people. It's like it was an abject failure. It was like it was too little, too late, and just not with crappy supplies. Just does not do anything. Does not do anything. Um, I should actually let's go back to, and there's also the ethnic cleansing. Basically, the region of Assiniboia, it's like along the southern border where the railway is going to go through. Once the railway is going to go through there, that's when the conservatives decide, nope, all these people, we're moving them away from the border because we're worried about security issues. We're worried about we're clearing off what's now going to become very valuable land, railway land. And we're going to clear the natives peoples away from it, and that's something that the chief pound maker, I believe, it's like the second that happens, that the railway goes through here, we're screwed. They're gonna move us, and indeed, that's exactly what happens. And like 5,000 people alone got moved from like Cypress Hill due to the railway. Um, and yeah, I mean, we get quotes, kind of selective quotes, I have to say, from Daschuk of like from John A. MacDonald. We cannot allow them to die for want of food. Dot dot dot. We're doing all we can by refusing food until the Indians are on the edge of starvation to reduce costs, which is very damning. And I mean, really, the full quote isn't that much better. Um, that's like from that dot dot dots. It's like it is true that Indians, so long as they are fed, will not work. It's like that gives you the attitude of the time. However, there does seem to be a thing of, we don't want them to starve, but we're also trying to reduce costs. We're not going to spend too much money on them because they're lazy. It's like, it's still deeply gross. Um, we have someone, he quotes Sir Leonard Tilley, the finance minister, like, they must work or starve, which is, sounds very familiar. It's like, oh, if you're poor, it's just because you're lazy. That gets used by government then, still gets used now of a really, really shitty thing. It's just it's being used against the most disadvantaged people of this time who are Daschuk actually does a really good thing of giving the example of the Dakota, these native people who would actually they've been farming in, I think it's Minnesota, since like the 19th century, came up to Canada and were farming and were farmers, and they were independent of the treaty and reservation system during this time. And as a result, not being dependent on bison, being skilled farm laborers when they were like in demand in the Northwest Territories, the TB, like, probably, they're not immune from the disease and all that, but basically they did as good as their white neighbors, which is like one of these like, oh, maybe things couldn't have been as good as the Dakotas because they had a long history of actually being in farming, but you do get the sense like if people had given a shit about these people, it could have been a lot different for them, which is how Daschuk leaves the chapter. Now, Daschuk is very much, I think, is an academic historian. He is assuming that it really feels like he's assuming that the audience for this book are people who are already deeply steeped in Canadian history. Not that deeply steeped in. I feel myself struggling to catch up in each chapter, like, trying to fill in the holes where I think he's left, and he hasn't put context in. He's also not that great at doing kind of a narrative storytelling. I did find, throughout this book, there has been so much death, so much tales of like mass dying of people. And then there's just like this one paragraph where they talks about this family of Kukwa Awit, this guy who arrived at the Victoria Mission with his starving family. And, one son was unconscious and he died 5 days after they arrived. And another's who's like, whose nose was bleeding, couldn't be stopped, died 9 days after that. And then finally, like, the distraught father, who was just skin and bones, left for the plains, where he reportedly too had died from hunger. This is taken from a report from the Saskatchewan Herald. of the time. And it's just like that kind of, it's like it's really important to have the history, to have the broad overview, but actually to have more dropping into those kind of individual human moments. I know I'm a dumb human being who reacts I react more to that story, unfortunately, than I'd react to 500 people died here, 20 people died here. Those are numbers, whereas just even that kind of like a simplest story, it's like, oh, that kind of that punches me more of like, oh yeah, this is what's happening. So I'm enjoying I'm enjoying the book, but I do find like after each chapter I need to kind of organize it in my own brain, because I don't know if Daschuk has done it as well as he could have. I mean, I think his goals seem to be more in the kind of academic of, I'm going to put together a lot of kind of history, a lot of disparate research, and make this form a tale. But he hasn't made it as narrative of a tale, as impactful that way. That said, it's obviously a book that's become a bestseller in Canada. It's something that has sparked a lot of debate with people, a lot of debate about John A. Macdonald and his culpability. And I think actually maybe quite rightly, a lot of people saying, yeah, it's like, yeah, he was shitty, and he was amongst all the entire Canadians being shitty, of having an opposition saying, why aren't you cutting costs even more? Where, he's saying like, and his defender saying, well, actually he doubled and actually tried to increase spending on that. But they can't say like, well, no, his true focus was getting this railway. It's like he had bigger concerns, and Native people were collateral ethnic cleansing, and allowed to die in what's got to be just kind of a horrible, shameful blight on the start of what's supposed to be especially since the railway is such the myth of Canada, of like what's used as a symbol of Canada. It's like, oh yeah, built on the bones of the dead bodies of starved Native peoples who. He makes a good point. Because he brings up Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, who wrote a thing called "Poverty and Famines: An Essay on Entitlement and Deprivation," where saying that famine occurs not from lack of food, but from inequalities built into the mechanisms for distributing food. Just because people starve doesn't mean there isn't enough food. It's that it's not having enough to eat, it's that there's not being enough. That there was food back then that could have gotten to these Native peoples. Indeed, some of that was withheld from them to bring them to the brink of starvation, which even though there wasn't the scientific understanding perhaps at the time that this was going to then allow TB to erupt. So it's not even we're just evil. It's just that we're indifferent to these people, to let them die. So that's this chapter. I think we have 2 more chapters to go in this book. I feel like I'm doing a little university course with Sean with this book. Though we don't have a professor to give us the bigger context, we have to kind of struggle through on our own. I haven't even brought up Canadian history for dummies this week, just because I think that gets a little bit into the national policy, which I actually did learn about. So I knew what he was talking about when he briefly mentions it within this chapter. But yeah. So more videos later.